Science is derived from a Latin verb. Now this might sound kind of interesting, given that we know science as a noun, mostly. However, the verb it comes from means more or less to know. Okay, so science is basically about knowing. What does science know? Well, what does science try to know? Well, nowadays, when we talk about science, we for the most part talk about understanding the world. However, technically speaking, science is a way of understanding the world. There is a difference between understanding the world and how we understand the world, which is usually called scientific method. Now, the scientific method is basically a matter of, let's try some different things and see what happens, and let's try to get some idea of how the world works by drawing conclusions from our observations. Now, sometimes there is no try different things and see what happens. Why? Because sometimes it's just not practical to do a controlled experiment. For example, in astronomy, well, we can do controlled experiments by computer simulation, but can we actually do stellar engineering? Well, not yet. Hopefully someday, though, we will be able to. Now, trying to figure out how the world works is a very natural thing for all intelligent life forms, even though humanity has yet to encounter another one that can be recognized as sentient per se, or sapient, rather. So why? Because if you understand how the world works, you can exploit that to your advantage, which means that while our first method of hunting was basically stubborn it to death, i.e. persistence hunting, well, if we didn't learn that we could outrun animals, then culturally speaking, persistence hunting would not have persisted. We would probably have used other methods instead. Now, why? Because we know that among apes, young ones learn the art of hunting from their elders by observation and by bringing them out on basically training trips, i.e. sit there and watch. Even lions do this. Now, blundering about in ignorance is a bad idea, which is kind of sad how many people actually do this. I blunder about proudly in ignorance instead of actually actively trying to fix their issues, but I guess it's just too much effort sometimes to fix one's personal problems. Oh well, these things happen. A scientific approach beyond the very basic things, I say, let's chase after that antelope and see if we get exhausted first or the antelope gets exhausted first. By the way, assuming that the humans do so at a steady jog, they can keep the antelope above the trot-gallop phase transfer, the trot-gallop boundary, the speed, and that will make the antelope unable to do its usual panting thing that most mammals do to cool down. It would have to take deep breaths to keep on fueling its energy expenditure to keep galloping. And thus, it exhausts faster than humans do. Because humans, in addition to panting, we have, well, to replace panting mostly, we have sweat. Now, horses also have sweat glands, but they are mostly apocrine, whereas humans have eccrine sweat glands, which are much simpler and much more numerous. Now, for human culture, though, a more natural thing really is to listen to the tribal chief or the tribal elders and take their word as truth. Why? Because this allows the tribal elders to control the tribe better, and this is basically a prototype of the divine right of kings, mandate of heaven, etc. Other similar concepts. Now, why is this a thing that has culturally lasted? It's because it's beneficial to the guys who are in charge, which is why they encourage it. And thus, cultures that have this usually have better transitions of power, as in less chaos there, than cultures that don't, and thus they prevailed. Pretty much this. Now, inquiry. You might have heard of launch an inquiry into some situation or some disaster. Well, an inquiry is, as used in colloquial terms, pretty much an investigation, even in science. This is very different from how theory in science is completely different from theory in colloquial terms. Now, inquiry is a search for information and explanation. So, what's happening? Why is it happening? How is it happening? So on. Now, it mostly focuses on specific questions, even if the specific questions themselves can often end up being quite broad. For example, why does the sun always rise in the east? Well, that's all the way into the Earth spins on its own axis and we can't feel it territory, which is a broad problem, especially for ancient peoples to understand. The idea that, no, it feels like the Earth is stationary, but that's just because we're moving with it, is mind-boggling to an ancient person. Now, the inquisitive mind drives the progress of science, and with it, the progress of technology and all civilization as a whole. So, curiosity kills a cat, but let's just say that curiosity didn't kill the cat. They say that curiosity kills a cat, but that's because it was framed. Stupidity was what killed the cat. So it was curious and it was dumb, so it got into trouble that it couldn't get out of. Curiosity itself is what allows the cat to get the cream. Now, you've probably heard of the term the cat got the cream, but in fact, feeding cats milk after they are a particular age is often a quick way to give them diarrhea, because most mammals stop producing lactase, the enzyme needed to digest lactose effectively, after they mature. So after they reach a particular age. So lactose intolerance for a cat can have the same symptoms as it does for a human. For example, bloating, gas, diarrhea, so on. Now, we should note that while we might think of science as a rigidly structured process, often it can be quite chaotic. Why? Because, we're trying to find out something. We are on a quest for knowledge. Guys, on any quest, there is a fact of luck. Luck is important, because if one is unlucky, the experiment simply fails for no discernible reason. Sometimes this does happen. Or the experiment yields results that are completely different from what your hypothesis or your possible set of hypotheses predicted, or you get several contradictory experiments, which can result in being, quite a pain. Now, because of the randomness issue, controlled experiments are preferred to observational studies. For example, if we observe a bunch of different solar systems, different star systems, because solar system technically specifies that it's sol, as in our sun. So if we study a bunch of different star systems, and we find particular trends, we do not necessarily have a representative sampling of all star systems. There is a significant amount of randomness, whereas if we could set up our own star systems and then let the experiment run, first of all, we'd probably be a lot more advanced than we are now, unless we're doing this in a computer program. And second, we'd actually be able to do a controlled experiment, which can help reduce the amount of randomness. But wait a second. What if a random disturbance happens, such as a nearby star goes supernova randomly? Or alternatively, some sort of superweapon disrupts this solar system or star system that we are setting up. Because by the time we can do stellar engineering, we would probably have weapons able to disrupt them as well. or at least disrupt, say, planets in said star systems. Now, we should note that in controlled experiments, we, even outside big scales, we still can't control everything. Why? Well, let's say we have a bunch of volunteers for a medical test to test the efficiency of a particular drug. They have all sorts of random factors among them, and we can't control for even a good fraction of these factors. Because, well, we wouldn't have very many volunteers if we ordered that they all had to be locked up under the same life routine and the same diet and so on for however long the trial takes. Even if we still had enough volunteers, well, there would be other issues, such as the fact that their genes are different, perhaps they metabolize particular drugs differently, and so on. Did you know that while most drug tests are done on males, on men, women metabolize many drugs quite differently? For example, alcohol is metabolized faster by males. Other drugs, such as, say, some sleeping pills, also have this problem. Women who take the sleeping pills feel all groggy the next morning and have a hard time waking up. So, what is the problem? It turned out that they did the tests exclusively on men of similar body mass. Which, honestly, is not so smart. Given the fact that the difference between men and women, while a bit of a sensitive topic because it sounds almost sexist, they do metabolize drugs differently. This is just biological fact, which kind of obviates the claims of sexism, except for people who are more interested in politics than science. Now, data could be numbers. Data is often in numbers, such as in this plot here. Each of these scattered dots represents, well, 3 numbers actually. But what else can data be? Well, data can be just descriptions. Data can be simple, such as, oh, this many red cars pass this intersection today, this many blue cars pass this intersection today, and so on. Or it could be rather complicated to interpret and require a lot of computer work and mathematical modeling. So we must be able to figure out something from the data. But wait a second. If we must figure something out from the data to continue our scientific inquiry, then where do we get the data in the first place? Okay, it's pretty obvious that we get it from making observations. Now, if you never notice that there's something that's worth investigating, then is there going to be an investigation? Nope. So, the first step of any experiment is to notice that there is something to investigate. So, to notice that there's something worth investigating, that already requires observation, and then actually investigating it requires more observations. These observations can be direct or indirect, with tools or without tools. Although usually there is at least a tool of, say, pencil. Well, not in this case, but you get the idea. And paper. Recorded observations are called data. Data is the information that we base all scientific inquiries on. Now, not all data is in numbers. Some of it, for example, say you're describing peacocks courting peahens. Please note that peacocks, as a general term, only refers to male peafowl. They are called peafowl, not peacocks, even though often we just call them, oh, whatever type peacock. Green peacocks, blue peacocks, whatever. They are not. By the way, peahens are like other pheasants, except in this case really huge compared to most other pheasants. Peahens are really dully colored. So they are in camouflage colors, which makes it easier for them to survive. The peacocks are showy. It's a matter of, hey, I'm still alive even though I have this huge tail weighing me down. I must have good genes. By the way, this is the same reason that in the past, before people started recognizing smoking as a sign of stupidity, i.e., you know full well that it can give you lung cancer very easily, and you're still doing this, wow, you're dumb. Before that, people found smoking kind of attractive, not only because of advertisements, but also because of the instinct of, well, they're doing something stupid and they're still alive, therefore they must have otherwise good genes. Although honestly, that severely underestimates the value of intelligence, which is kind of sad. Now, when you describe a peacock courting a peahen, you often describe it as, oh, it does a jump, whatever. How high did it jump? It shakes its tail several times. How many times? At what frequency? At what angle to the sun? These are not recorded. So it is often qualitative data that you get. Please note that peacocks, like this one, often in many species of peacocks, or peafowl, as you can see, even as us bio students often get confused between the common name, which is peacock, for this type of creature, and peafowl, which is the actual term. Alright, so peafowl need not necessarily have eye spots on their tails. In fact, this example, for one, does not have eye spots that are nearly as obvious as the typical blue-green ones. Now, these little clumps could be interpreted as eye spots if you, say, tilt your head and squint or something. Now, what about this is potentially quantitatively important? Well, angle of tail feather spread. What about angle to the sun? We know that things that look shiny often do so in particular ways at particular angles to the light. And given that the light in nature is typically the sun, well, that means that this qualitative data could be relevant in a quantitative way. But usually we don't study these quantitative parts very much for these courtships, except as a vague note. Subsequent inquiry, on the other hand, could change this. For example, studying the songs of particular birds, or figuring out that there are several species of lacewings instead of just one species because they all look the same. Their courting songs are different, which is how we differentiate between, say, several species of green lacewings. Now, subsequent inquiry might shed more light on the quantitative versus qualitative parts that are important, but that is often later, after the preliminary investigation, which shows us that, oh, the male peacock's giant tail, well, okay, not male peacock, just peacock, because it's male peafowl. See, once again, it's common that even experienced scientists will slip up when referring to these things when the colloquial term is too similar to what they're used to. So male peafowl, their giant tails are used for a courtship and as a handicap display. So that is the general strokes. Now, how are they used for courtships specifically? What part of it appeals to females the best? Well, that will depend on subsequent inquiry, which may study everything from the courtship orientation to the sun, to what sort of feather pattern females generally prefer, to what sort of tail length females prefer, and so on. When we have obtained a bunch of data, what happens next? Well, we have to make some conclusions. So we call this inductive reasoning. So we take all this data, we combine it in one place, and we make a conclusion. So inductive, you can think of that as in. Now deductive reasoning, you can think of that as deconstructing. So breaking a big thing and into little things. So it would be to take generalizations and draw specific conclusions from it. Whereas inductive is to take observations and create a generalization. So they are reverse processes. A core tenet of the cell theory, which is that all organisms are made of cells, is a conclusion from 200 years of microscope users, whether they are hobbyists or professionals. Now, deductive counterpart of the cell theory, the all organisms are made out of cells, would be all organisms are made of cells. A cow is an organism, therefore a cow is made out of cells. Or a fish, or a bird, or whatever. Now, in terms of hypotheses, what are hypotheses? Well, these are what are colloquially called theories. You may notice that a scientist will not slip up on the colloquial theory versus the scientific theory because the difference is far too huge compared to, oh, male peacock. No, that's male peafowl. But this is something that scientists will never slip up on because it is very important to the general process of science. A hypothesis is an idea about how something might possibly work. It is testable. It is a possible explanation that we will put on trial by an experiment. If we conduct our experiment, then we should get a, if we do this, then something happens. If that something does happen, then the hypothesis is not falsified. On the other hand, if the prediction of the hypothesis does not happen, then first of all, we could potentially have done something wrong. Second, the hypothesis is usually falsified. Unless we can confirm that we did something wrong, and upon later repetitions, because repetitiveness, repeatability, is important for scientific inquiry. You don't want to make an absurd claim such as, ooh, I made a mushroom grow from one cell to a full-size mushroom in 1 second, because it is not repeatable. So if it's not repeatable, it's not scientifically valid. Scientifically valid experiments must stand up to repeated scrutiny. For example, we can say that antibiotic resistance is due to the exposure of bacterial populations to antibiotics. This is an inadvertent experiment that has been done many, many times in hospitals around the world, unfortunately for us. Now, in colloquial use, theory is, I have a theory that perhaps this is the case. Well, that's pretty much exactly what a hypothesis in science is. A theory in science is much, much more complicated. It is supported by a large amount of evidence, and it can be used to formulate many, many, many different hypotheses. Whereas a single hypothesis usually does not spin off additional hypotheses nearly as easily as a theory would. Suppose we have a flashlight. It doesn't work. Now, we could have the hypothesis that it's a burnt out bulb. We could have the hypothesis that the batteries are dead. We could have the hypothesis that the wiring is broken. These are scientific hypotheses. They are scientifically valid because they are testable and therefore falsifiable. Arguing that you have divine or demonic or whatever else intervening to prevent your thing from working is not something you can scientifically test. It is not refutable, therefore it is not a valid scientific hypothesis. Similarly, religion is not a scientific matter because we cannot test it scientifically, experimentally, and therefore, well, of course, if somebody decides to claim that they can walk on water, they are welcome to do so, and we can examine how they do this. Unfortunately, in the modern era, other than specifically equipped stunts, i.e., say having columns under the water to step on, we have not yet seen anybody actually walk on water without assistance. Now, deductive logic tells us that if the wiring is broken, then replacing the wiring or fixing the wiring will fix the flashlight. So this is deduction. This is a, oh, if this, then that. So say, oh, we know that all organisms are made of cells. If something is an organism, it must be made out of cells. Or then it must be made out of cells, rather. So this is an experiment that tests the hypothesis. If the flashlight works again, then we did not prove that the hypothesis is false. But for all we know, it could have been that, oh, it's just a bad contact with the light bulb, and jostling the flashlight while we're replacing the wiring managed to fix it. It might not be the wiring that's broken. So we haven't proved necessarily that the hypothesis is right. Similarly, if replacing the bulb fixes the flashlight, maybe the original one was just loose. It does not falsify the hypothesis, but it still does not prove it right. Therefore, we can see that it is almost always not possible to test every single alternative hypothesis. So proving a hypothesis is, for the most part, impossible. A hypothesis is reinforced by surviving repeated tests that attempt to falsify it and manage to eliminate alternatives. Not necessarily both at the same time. Why? Because many tests might be specifically designed to falsify a particular hypothesis, and if they fail to falsify it, that does not necessarily mean that it is right. It also does not necessarily eliminate any alternatives. Now, flexibility. When it comes to the scientific method, often things are not quite as cut and dry or cut and paste or whatever your preferred terminology is, as our flashlight example. Experiments are usually a lot more complicated and consider more factors. Sometimes, when you make an observation, it might be completely, what? Well, once more information is acquired, you might be able to make sense of old data. Or, alternatively, you could find that you are asking completely the wrong question. For example, when studying many mental illnesses in the early 20th century, many psychologists focused a little bit too much on the nurture aspect, i.e., environmental influences such as formative experiences. Now, while there are indeed plenty of mental illnesses that can be caused by formative experiences, it is also the case that many of them are due to chemical imbalances in the brain, which may or may not be treatable chemically. Why? Because the blood-brain barrier is very effective at preventing most chemicals from crossing from the blood into the brain. Unfortunately, certain chemicals, such as, say, ethanol, are still reasonably competent at it. Hence why, being drunk, well, it inhibits one's reasoning ability, reaction time, and other mental processes. Now, other hypotheses can be rather difficult to test, so it might take a long time for them to be tested to satisfaction. For example, in the mid-19th century, a guy, Bates, came up with Batesian mimicry. What is Batesian mimicry? Well, Mullerian mimicry is, or Mullerian, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it, is when two harmful species imitate one another. So say various wasps, many of them have the same yellow and black banding pattern. This warns predators that they are dangerous, so do not attack. They imitate each other because then predators learn faster, and therefore it's better for both of them. And diverging from that color scheme would get them attacked, so they don't diverge. Batesian mimicry is when a harmless creature, whatever it might be, or plant even, imitates a harmful one, whether by looks or chemical signals or whatever. Now, an earlier example would be a certain experiment involving snakes in the Carolinas, using plasticine fake snakes and testing if scarlet king snakes were protected by their banding pattern where there were no coral snakes versus where there were. Another one, one that you might see in, say, conditioning, i.e. animal psychology, would be feeding viceroy butterflies, which strongly resemble monarch butterflies in terms of their orange and red coloration pattern, but which are not toxic and are delicious to birds. Feeding them to young blue jays, which have not been exposed previously to monarchs, results in the blue jays happily gobbling them up. But if you have a young blue jay eat one monarch, it will eat it, and very quickly it will puke. So after it pukes, it, for the most part, will not touch another monarch for the rest of its life. Viceroy butterflies resemble monarchs enough that the blue jay will also be strongly averse to them. On the snake's example, the researchers took some wires, used plasticine to make fake snakes, laid them out, and checked them a while later for predator attacks. Where the scarlet king snake, which is commonly found in people's swimming pools, especially in the springtime, where the scarlet king snake lived, well, we know that only part of its range is also inhabited by the eastern coral snake. So they decided to take king snake patterned fake snakes and brown fake snakes and put them both in the field. It was found that where there were no coral snakes, most of the attacks, about 85% or so, were on the fake king snakes, because this pattern is a lot more obvious on, say, the forest floor than just what amounts to a brown rope. On the other hand, where there were coral snakes, predators were noted to attack the brown snakes similarly more often, as in 85% of the time, and attack the fake king snakes only about 15% of the time. Now, predators included coyotes, foxes, raccoons, but in some cases also black bears. We should point out that the eastern coral snake, while quite venomous, is only responsible for about 100 bites a year in the United States. So ever since antivenom became available in the 1960s, by the way, it was discontinued in 2010 because it was unprofitable to make the antivenom, the lethality rate of coral snake bites was low from 1960s onward. The lethality rate normally is actually not that high compared to other famous venomous snakes. But of course, it's still more than enough to inspire children's rhymes, such as red on yellow, dangerous fellow. But we should note that this does not hold for other coral snakes, such as, say, in the Caribbean. So, for example, on the Isle of Tortuga and other places like that. Tortuga is most known for being a pirate's cove, but in fact it is a place on, well, Haiti and the Dominican Republic nowadays. So, if you are asked about this Pleistocene snake example, that dated from 2001, and it was conducted by the University of Pittsburgh. Well, researchers from that university. We should note that in the wild, usually, why is it that we consider the aversion to be instinctive instead of a learned response? Well, first of all, in terms of learning, these snakes are really quite different in terms of their coloration banding pattern. Raccoons are not that dumb. Unfortunately for raccoons, coral snakes are not good at controlling the amount of venom they inject. Given the lethality rate for people is typically around 10 to 20% untreated, historically, because only about 40% of bites against people actually injected venom. The other ones typically missed. So, given that the lethality rate against people is rather limited, well, given the difference in body mass between a person and a raccoon, well, most attempts to attack these snakes tend to result in the would-be attacker not surviving to learn. Let's just leave it at that. Alright, so let's once again hammer in the fact that in science, a theory, such as the theory of evolution, is very different from a theory in everyday life. A theory in everyday life is more of a hypothesis, is science, if that. Because many theories in everyday life might not be testable scientifically. Scientific theories, they're generally huge things. So they contain many, many, many implications, each of which can spin off additional hypotheses. And these hypotheses are testable, they are falsifiable, and if they are falsified, then this could lead to serious problems with the theory, such as it being, well, toppled. An example of a theory would be the theory of natural selection, and an example of a testable hypothesis based on it would be, say, bird beak length related to flower nectar tube length. We know that there is a moth that has a very, very long proboscis, i.e. tongue. That moth fertilizes a flower with a really long nectar tube, and in fact that moth was predicted based on the existence of that flower. It was discovered much later than the flower was. Now that moth, the prediction that that moth existed, that would be a hypothesis. We hypothesize, based on our observation of this flower having a nectar tube of this length, that a moth or butterfly or some other fertilizer with a tongue or proboscis of the appropriate length must exist. And the hypothesis was proven to be valid. It was not falsified. If it was falsified, then they would not have discovered said creature. Scientific theories generally have a large amount of evidence backing them, or at least not refuting them. So they survive many checks, almost continually, and in some cases they are updated by testing. In some cases they can end up being falsified by testing, such as early scientific theories that, well, say the Earth is perfectly round, or alternatively Copernicus' theory that the Earth traveled around the Sun in a perfect circle. Those were updated and the original versions were falsified. Now, let's do some examples. Example problems. What is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? Well, we can think of inductive as taking many things in and making them one thing. So that's taking many observations and drawing a generalization. And deductive would be, say we can think of that as deconstructing. So we take one big thing and break it up into little things. In this case, we take one big thing, a generalization, and apply it to specific examples as needed. Why is evolution called a theory? Evolution is called a theory because in science you can never prove anything completely beyond doubt. Because for all we know, we might as well hypothesize that we are all living in an imagination. So this whole universe, our reality, is all our imagination. But that's not scientifically testable because we would specify that this imagination could not be tested for. Evolution is called a theory because so far there is no evidence that has disproven it. All evidence found so far has supported it. It has a vast backing of support. It can spin off many additional hypotheses. It has vast, wide implications. And therefore we consider it to be a scientific theory. So mostly confirmed, pretty much. Now, if we move the snake experiment to an area where only coral snakes lived, what would the results be like? What about where neither snake lived? Well, if we moved it to a place where only coral snakes lived, then the predation rate would probably be even more lopsided. In terms of the predators favor attacking the brown artificial snakes because the conditioning for the instinct to not attack a banded pattern snake would probably be even stronger. Simply because there is no chance of a predator accidentally attacking a king snake and finding it to be delicious. Instead, basically all predators that attack banded pattern snakes would be dead. Which is, of course, a very heavy selective pressure against attacking banded pattern snakes, and a selective pressure for an instinctive aversion to them. Now what about whether neither snake lived? Well, if neither type of snake lives there, there is no pressure whatsoever on predators to have any aversion to attacking banded pattern snakes, and most likely they would attack the banded pattern snakes just because they are so obvious on the forest floor compared to what amounts to a brown rope among a bunch of brown and dead leaves. So that's it for this section. And hopefully now we understand why evolution is considered the core tenet of biology as a science. And why just because evolution is called a theory doesn't mean that it is just a theory as we use in everyday language.